Hello, this is PTTGRW and welcome to another tutorial video on modding Kerbal Space Program. Today we're going to be looking at science, one of my favorite career mode additions that Squad added. Now I'm going to open up my blank config file here, I just called it science stuff. And in order to add your own experiments, you need to call something called experiment definition. And what this does is this will tell us what exactly this experiment is. And it needs an ID. Now, the ID can be whatever you want. This is simply just so we can call it when we're actually creating a part that uses this science. But since we're going to use one of the stock parts, we're just going to call this dish. And it also needs a title. Now, the title is just really an identifier. It doesn't matter. You don't really call it anywhere, so we're just gonna label it this. You won't actually see it turn up anywhere, but base value. Now the base value is the science, or sorry, not the science, it is the transmit size. Now this is kind of weird because you think base value, you think it'd be the science, but it's the transmit size. So, how large do we want this packet to be? Well, 30 MITs, as they're labeled in Kerbal Space Program, is what we'll have our size be. Now this is where we define how much science this thing can actually have. And we're going to say 120. Now, it won't necessarily be 120 because since science is modified based on what biome you are, what planet you're at, if you're landed or not, whether or not it's a surface sample or not, because we haven't defined that yet. It changes how much it's worth. So keep that in mind, that this is not completely static. And data scale will tell us how large does this file have to transmit. Like, we set our base value to be 30. If we put a data scale of 2, our transmit value would be 60 MITs. If we put it to 3, it'd be 90. We're going to leave it at 1, so it's only a 30 MIT data transmit. Now, a couple more things that you can have is require atmosphere. And we'll set this to false. This is things for like atmospheric experiments, where you actually need like the air and oxygen around. It's pretty self-explanatory. Now, situation mask is just a bit mask, and it's set to 63 on the GUI experiment, so I'm going to use the same one. And same with biome mask. These are just binary masks that I can't exactly tell you their exact use because I haven't been reading the source code into what they do. But once you have all of this set up, all you need to do is put in results. And this is where the magic really happens for all of the science fun. Now, I'm just going to finish filling out all of the curly brackets here, and let's look at what we can put in results. Now, the first thing you always need to start with in results is something called default, and then set it equal to something. This is when the experiment that you're doing is not in a location it can understand. It will just call the default. It's basically a giant switch statement, if you know programming. Now, for default, we're just going to put something like, I don't know if this is actually doing any science. And that's all you need. We'll put a period. Now, this is what it will say when it can't find something else to say, basically. And let's put another one. Now, when you call where you want science to go, you basically call the planet name, where it is. For this example, we're going to use surface landed, and then you call the biome that it's landed in. So basically you have planet, what kind of state it's in. Is it landed on the surface? Is it in space? Is it high in the atmosphere? And then you call what biome it's at. And we're just going to put launch pad because the launch pad is its own biome. So basically when we're on the launch pad, what's it going to say? Well, we haven't really taken off yet. And our Kerbals will just wonder why we're doing science. Let's do another example here. So we're going to pick Kerbin again. So Kerbin, and this is going to be flying low, and that's it. Now this just means when we're flying low in the atmosphere, anywhere in Kerbin, then we will get it. If we were to put something such as Kerbin Kerbin in space low, then this would be if we're in a low orbit. If we change this to high, then that would be if we're high in orbit. We could even just leave this as in space, so it doesn't really matter where we are in space, it will still be said. And you can set these to anywhere. Basically, you give a planet, a location, and a biome, and it sets out. But Kerbin flying low, what do we want this to say? Well, we are now flying. And this is, we'll leave it at this. I could put 1,000 of these in just to cover all of the different biomes and all the different statics, places you can be, but I'm not going to for the sake of time. But now that we have our experiment definition set up, we need to actually tell something that can use the ID of dish. And for that, we're going to be using module manager again. Now the part I want to use is that com dish. It's like a cylinder and it kind of unfolds into a big dish. So at part com dish name equals, and this is the name of the, getting ahead of myself here, module, and just do my usual formatting. Give some extra space down here. Okay. Now module name equals module science experiment. And this is the name of the module. This is what tells us that this is the science experiment. Well, how does it know what experiment it's going to be? Well, experiment ID equals, I wonder what we need to put in here. Well, this is an ID of an experiment, so I think we'd put dish. So, dish. And now we also need experiment action name. This is basically when you click on the button to perform the experiment. What is it going to say? Well, test the dish. We also need reset action name. And this is when we try to reset it. What is it going to say? Well, dispose of dish data. And a couple other things that you can set just for configurations is use staging. And use staging basically says, can you push the spacebar and stage this to activate it? For this, we're going to set it to false. That means we cannot stage it. Other things that stage are decouplers. When you push the spacebar and the decouplers in the stage, it decouples. That's what use staging means. Now, use action groups. We're going to set this to true. This just means we can bind it to an action group. Hide UI when unavailable. This is for things such as if you're time warping. You cannot perform science when you're time warping. So hide UI when it's unavailable will make it so you can't actually push the button to think you're going to do it, or push the button and wait for nothing to happen because it can't. So we're going to set this to true, that it will hide it when it's unavailable. Now xmit data scalar, and this is another floating point. The transmit data scalar basically says, well, how much are we going to scale your data when we transmit it? Well, since this for the GOO experiment is 0.3, meaning the transmit data is 1/3 roughly of the actual experiment's max value. or the value of the experiment it currently got. Now, we don't want to do this. Since this is a dish, I think it should actually have a larger experiment transfer. So we're going to set it to 2.5, which means when we perform our science, if we transmit it, we will get 2.5 times the science that we would have normally gotten, as long as we adhere to the fact that we did set our science cap to about 120. Now, fx modules equals 0. Data is collectible equals true. Now this one basically says, can we bring a Kerbal outside in EVA mode, right click on this object and collect the data from it? Yes, we can. If we set it to false, that means we can't collect the data out of it, and we'll just have to bring the experiment back with us if we want full credit. But since transmitting is worth more, I think we won't really be needing to bring it back. Now, collect action name equals, well, what do we want it to say when we try to collect the data? So we're going to say just collect dish data. And interaction range is normally set to 1.3. This is just the distance we can right click on the object to collect the data. And this, there's actually one more that I do want to go over, or a couple of things actually. Now there's one more value in here that we can add, and I'm just going to add it where the other parts tend to add it. Rerunnable. This says, can we use this more than once? Basically, crew reports. When you do a crew report, you can continuously do more crew reports without the part becoming basically jammed or locked and needing to be cleaned by the science station. Rerunnable set to true makes it work like a crew report. If you set it to false or leave it out entirely, it will assume it's false, in which case it'll be like a mystery goo experiment, where when you do the science you can only do it once. If you transmit it, then you can't do the goo experiment again until you clean it with a science lab, or you just get another goo experiment. But we want this to be rerunnable, so we are going to set it to true. And we can close our module here. But we're not going to close the app part yet, because there's another module I want to add. And this is the module science container. So, module, and this one's name equals module science container. And review action name. Now, before I get into this one, the module science container basically says, can this store data? Like the crew reports, if you go to your mystery goo, you can take the mystery goo experiment outside with your Kerbal, and then you can store it in the command node, or the cockpit that you were flying with. And this is what this one says. Can we store it? Yes, we can. And a couple parameters that it has are, first off, review action name. And this is going to just be review stored data, just generic. Store action name, store the data. EVA only storage. Now this one means, can Kerbals in EVA store it? Are they the only ones that can store it? So if you set it to true, only Kerbals can store experiments in this. Now there are some mods out there that use hard drives. One in particular that uses a hard drive, and this is, for the hard drive, would actually have to be set to false, meaning you can store experiments while you're flying this. You could actually store experiments in this module with a probe. You don't need to have Kerbals run around and move the data for you. So we're going to set this to false, meaning we do not need Kerbals in EVA to store the data. And lastly, we have storage range. Now this is kind of unnecessary. if you have the above one, if you have this set to false, then this one's kind of unnecessary. But if you do set this one to true, then this will tell you how far your Kerbal can interact with the module. And we're going to do 1.3, and I believe these are all measured in meters. And as always, we do need to close everything, our module and our @part declaration. And this is all that we need. So we defined our own experiment up here, and we gave it some results based on where we are. We also gave it our base transmit size, our science cap, the scale of it, and we opened up the part com dish to give it a couple modules, one that allows it to do the new experiment we added, and another one that allows it to store all different kinds of experiments. So with this done, we're just going to save this config file, and I'll see you guys in the game to try this out. Welcome back into Kerbal Space Program. Now, this is the part that we were modding up, the Communitron 88-88, and if you look, we have a new function here, test the dish. That is our science value, and when we click on it, it's going to play a nice little animation here, and we are going to get our science dish test from Launchpad, but we haven't really taken off yet. That's the one we set. And if you look, the data size is 30 MITs, our recovery is 9, and our transmit is 250%, or 2.5 times what the recovery would be. And we set this max to be 120. Well, why is it so low? That's because the launch pad has a reduced amount of science gain. If we were to take off, which we will in actually a minute, then we can see that we will get more when we're flying low or when we get into space. Now, transmit, if we do decide to transmit it, we'll just use some of our electric charge. We'll get our science, and if you look, we can run this experiment again because we set it to be allowed to run more than once. Now we'll turn SAS on, throttle up, and we're just going to take off a little ways. Don't want to be going too fast, we'll destroy our dish, but we're going to try to test the dish again. See if Ferrum Aerospace won't break this. And it plays its animation, and we're now flying, and it's worth more science, and this is while we're flying, so we'll transmit it again, use a little bit more electric charge, there. And we got more science, and now that it's safely put away, let's see if we can't get up to pretty close to low orbit and see if we can get even more. And like I said, the values of science are completely dependent on where exactly you are. For example, if you're in space, if you're near MOHO, they're worth more than if you're in space near Kerbin. If you're on the moon, Minmus's surface is worth more than the moon's surface because it's harder to get to. And it's just set up that way. So once we leave the atmosphere, we should be getting a lot more. As you can see, we're going really fast. This has got some amazing acceleration. But we're just going to go straight up in order to get as high as we can. Let's see, what does our apoapsis look like? Oh yeah, that's plenty high. Oh, all our fuel's burned out. We're just going to speed up, get completely out of the atmosphere, and now that we're in space, let's test the dish again. And you can see we've gotten a lot more now because as we get further away and get to harder to reach areas, science value goes up. If you already knew this, congratulations, but since we don't have now, the reason I really wanted to come into space was because we don't have anything set for a science in space near Kerbin. It's going to play the default. I don't know if this is actually doing any science. Well, since it's going to be worth 75, I'd say at least it's doing something. At least something we can agree with. But this is pretty much all you need. It's fairly easy. Now, mind you, if you have a part that does not need to be extended to be used, for example, this one needs to be extended to transmit data, which is the only reason it's extending for the science. But if you have a solid part, maybe a fuel tank that does science, like you test the composition of the fuel or something, then you're going to see that it doesn't need to play the animation to work. It should just hop on instantly and start performing science. But this is pretty much all you need to know to get your own science modules working and your own parts, or parts that already exist working with your new science module. I'm going to be right back outside to show you how Kerbal Space Program does this by default. Now, we're back outside in our game data folder, and we have Squad. Now when you left click on Squad and you open up resources, you're going to find two files. This is the resource one, and this is science devs. We're going to open up science devs. Now, do take into account that there's this warning. If you don't want to read any of the science text, the little sentences they give off, then just stop the video here. Otherwise, we're going to go down here and look at them to show you how Kerbal Space Program does this. Give you a second to just close out. And now that we're going down, gives you plenty of warning, and did warn you, so you guys know, not spoiling anything. And we've already called all of this, so you can see how this one works, but this is what I want to get into, the results. Now, I spoke a little bit earlier that you name the planet, you name what it's doing, like where are you getting the science from, and you name the biome. Well, this applies to pretty much every single planet and every single biome. But if you have Duna in space and then you try to put something like desert at the end, it won't work. Because Duna does not have a desert biome. Now, as you can see, there are more than one, Dres in space and Dres in space. If you have two, it will basically just roll for whichever one it wants. It doesn't decide. But if you see, we don't have Dres high in space or Dres low in space, meaning that only if we're in space at Dres are we actually going to do science. If you want, though, you can add your own. For example, we have Gilly in space. Well, Gilly looks like a fun one to edit. Now, unfortunately, the only way you can actually add science, because Module Manager can't read into these, since this has no name, Module Manager can't really access it. You can access the experiment definition, and you can change like data scales or science caps for different experiments, but you can't change the results. So the only way to add science, and one of the more popular science mods known as Crowdsource Science has to do this. It actually tells you to completely replace this config because it's the only way that it works. But if we do Gilly in space low, so if we're in low orbit around Gilly, then we can say something such as, I can hardly feel the gravity. And what this will do is, now if we're low in space around Gilly, we're going to say, this is going to be the science log that pops up, I can hardly feel the gravity. Of course, this will only pop up for the title, which is the crew report. So only for the crew report will this one show up. However, I don't really want to be editing this config, so I'm just going to remove this. But do note, you can't dynamically add any science to parts, science definitions that already exist without editing this file. Now, you can edit your own very easily by going into your own config and editing it like I showed you at the beginning of this, but unfortunately for stock Kerbal, we can't just edit this without manipulating this file altogether. Aside from that, I am PTTGRW signing out. This has been your tutorial on how to add your own science modules, parts, and results into the Kerbal Space Program. Hope you enjoyed.